Let's go for another GTA Wizard weekly coaching today. Hope you're all good. Hope you have been having a good week. And hopefully we can learn something together here again. All right, see some familiar faces here. Glad to have you all here. And let's begin today's weekly coaching. For today, we're going to discuss a topic which was suggested by one of the members in GTA Wizard Weekly Coaching's channel. And there were a lot of very good suggestions. So I would like to talk about some of those first. So Josette, or Josette, I don't know how to pronounce, suggested for us to talk about how to identify pure strategies and mix strategies with certain combos. I thought it was a very, very good topic, very good suggestion. However, I didn't have enough time to prepare something that I would find good enough for the weekly coaching. So this one is going to have to be another time, but we're definitely going to tackle that because certainly very interesting and very important. So the combination of these two things make it so that we certainly have to talk about that. So very good suggestion by our friend, but it's not going to be today. Bunjo one suggested flapjack raises from big blind on different textures versus small c-bet. I also thought it was a very good suggestion. However, it's something that it's simpler than the other suggestions. So maybe we can cover that in the future when we don't have anything else that is as relevant as the other things. But certainly a very good suggestion as well from Bunjo. The one that got more likes was the one from Hedberg, which is deep stack adjustments pre-flop. And it is a good suggestion. However, I wouldn't feel comfortable giving advice on this because I haven't really studied much deep stack play, both pre-flop and post-flop. My focus has always been on studying 100 big blinds, so I wouldn't feel very comfortable giving advice. It would be mostly me just browsing sims with you guys, which is probably not the best use of everyone's time. If in the future I have more confidence in giving advice on this, then we can definitely return to this topic. Right, so the one that I think was the most relevant for today is suggestion for Alessandro, which is tiny bets on the river, 10% bets on the river. And this is a very, very interesting topic because it allows us to understand uh, some properties of the equilibrium, and it allows us to expand our current understanding of the game as well. So I thought it was a pretty good opportunity to discuss some of those concepts. Right, so that's what we're gonna have for today. Please keep coming with the suggestions in the GTA Wizard channel. I'm always going to be reading through those and bringing whatever you guys feel is the most relevant, what you guys like the most, provided that I do have the confidence to bring that topic for today. If I were listening to the most liked suggestion would be the deep stack pre-flop stuff, but that specifically, I don't feel very comfortable sharing any knowledge because I don't have many or don't have much knowledge on that. Right, so let's begin for today. And before we jump into the simulations and discuss the concepts, I want to hear from you guys in the chat. Have you ever used 10% bets on the river in your own game? If not, or if yes, what is the theoretical explanation for those bets? So what do you guys think? What would be your hypothesis for what is a theoretical explanation for the existence of very tiny bets on the river? Let's begin with that, and then we can move on to some examples and try to understand the mechanics behind those interactions. It should make up for a very interesting discussion. All right, so do you guys use it? Regardless of the answer, why you think it's a thing sometimes? And I'm gonna share my screen so that we at least have something to take a look while you're answering. And let me put this here. All right. I'm gonna share this. All right. So you should be seeing my screen, browser with GTO Wizard. This is the first answer here from Rob Boss. I've always used for thin value. Interesting. So I've always used as small as 10% sizing. That's cool. Not many people use those. Matthias said never used. DV of checking and betting super small OPs very close. That will almost always be true just because of the nature of the sizing. But we're going to see that there's a lot of interesting theoretical concepts that go on in there and some exploitative considerations that is going to make it for a very good exploit. Stephen said not very often. Right. What about hypothesis for why is it a thing? So yeah, just joined, said Manuel. So we're going to be talking about tiny bets on the river. Tiny bets, 10% pot bets on the river. And the first question that I asked is, do you guys use it? Have you ever used it? And regardless of whether you have used it or not, what would be your hypothesis for why it's actually a thing sometimes at equilibrium? Stephen said that he uses sometimes as an exploit. Nice. What are you trying to exploit when you use a very tiny bet on the river? If you can be more specific. João Oliveira said, we need to have our range protected with strong hands that make sense to enter that bet size. I think in many situations it makes sense because villain won't find enough raises. Right, so. Well, in the second part of your answer, you're giving mostly an exploitative reasoning, right? So people are not going to find enough raises. That's going to increase the EV of some hands in the range that would allow to bet that sizing. But in the first part of your answer, it's more of a theoretical explanation that, or at least a theoretical requirement, right? So you have to have some nuts in there to avoid getting raised all the time. And then those two things don't go together, right? So if people are not raising enough, then it would probably not be a good idea for you to use that size at the top of your range, right? Because then they're not generating enough value for you. They're not putting enough money into the pot for you. But the two things you said certainly make sense. Max said never used it, but when you have a range of medium strength hands out of position and both players have nuts in range. Right, so one of the requirements in your opinion would be that we have middling hands and that both players have nuts in range. Why both players need to have nuts in range? Rob Boss said, I didn't realize this was out of position. I used the sizing as a blocking bet with my medium strength hands looking for showdown. Nice. Yeah, so IP, you're almost never going to see blocking bets from an equilibrium perspective. I didn't even mention that we were going to be talking about out of position, but you guys probably already know that IP, these bets are almost never going to happen simply because, well, the benefit of those bets is non-existent when you're IP. When you're IP, you can just check back and realize EV versus the hand you're already ahead of. So the only benefit that it would have would be if your opponent is lacking raises to the point where you can just reopen thinner for value, right? So we're mostly going to be talking out of position, but it's fine to use it as an exploit IP sometimes. That certainly is true. Sometimes in live play, betting that small can induce a large raise from villain. Nice. So depending on your opponent's tendencies, you can use that as an exploit to trick him into putting more money into the pot, right? That's certainly a thing, especially against aggressive recreationals. I think this can be a thing. Max said you need nutted hands to protect your small betting range, and when villain has lots of nutted hands, Your middling strength hands cannot bet very large, right? But it's almost like one answers the other, right? So if villain has a lot of nutty hands, then it's not possible for most of your hands to be very strong, right? You're gonna have to have middling or weak hands because we're saying that villain has a lot of nuts, and obviously, middling strength hands cannot really put too much money into the pot. So nice. So a lot of different answers, some different perspectives. A lot of you answering exploitative considerations, which is nice. Uh, it's not like we're focusing on exploits here, but it's certainly a part of this discussion, and we're gonna talk about that a lot today. Manuel said, kind of block bet where OP has to pay it off very often. We prevent some bluffs. We prevent some bluffs this way that we can't pay off. What do you mean exactly? I think I got your idea, but I'm not sure 100%. We prevent some bluffs this way that we can't pay off. So you're saying that with the very small bet, we are avoiding the option to check and then face a bet which we cannot call, right? I guess that's the main idea there. We're definitely going to talk a lot about that because it has to do with what's going on here. So let's move on to the first example. And you're going to see that we have we have two sets of different examples that it may seem counterintuitive, but later when we take a look at the distribution for both ranges, we're going to see why it's happening on both of these types of scenarios. Right, so one thing that I like to always think about when I'm studying equilibrium is not focus necessarily on the line on the board or variables that are not necessarily determinant to the strategy. What I want to look is the equity distribution for both ranges. So it's what I call a distribution matchup. So what's the distribution for the OP player? What's the distribution for the IP player? Once you know the distribution of both ranges, then understanding the equilibrium is much, much easier. It makes a lot of sense. When you're not looking at equilibrium from that perspective, it gets way harder. It gets much more difficult, or it's not very clear why certain strategies are the way they are. So we're going to focus a lot on understanding what kind of distribution makes sense for that strategy to exist. So that's my first question for you guys. Some of you have already answered something close to that, but let's try to be really specific or try to really imagine what would be a kind of distribution matchup in which betting very small makes sense in order for us to maximize our EV. So what the two ranges need to look like in order for this to make sense in you guys' own intuition now that we still haven't explored? It's totally fine to not know it for sure for now, but what would be the type of distribution for both ranges that you feel like, well, with these distributions, then I think it would make sense? And then try to talk about the amount of air in both players' ranges, the amount of middling hands, the amount of nuts. At least these three categories need to be in your mind. So amount of air, amount of nuts, amount of middling hands. Max answered, OP has 5% nuts, 95 middling hands. IP has 25 nuts, rest air. Probably that distribution is gonna end up being pure check for OP, right? So OP has 95 minion hands, and 5% only nuts is such a small number that if IP has any kind of nuts, he's going to want to bomb into that range, right? So if IP has 25% nuts, even though it has 75% air, because of the very low amount of air in out of position, then IP is just going to bomb the biggest possible size into that range, which greatly benefits the out of position nuts. right? Because IP's bluffs are always going to, or they're going to also bump into the pot to balance IP's value bets. So probably that distribution is going to come up with OP checking all strong hands or not all nutted hands, and therefore checking all of the medium hands as well. Rob Boss, SB would have equity advantage on all or most of the range to create this strategy. Equity advantage is a concept that is important, but it doesn't really paint the picture that we need to derive the strategy, right? When we say a certain range has equity advantage, all we're saying that in the aggregate, if you weight all of the different combos in the range and sum up their equities, then this range has a little bit more than this range. But it doesn't really tell us what the distribution of these two ranges are, right? You could have a range with 55% equity against one with 45, and there are countless possible distribution matchups that can produce those two range equities. So equity advantage in itself is not sufficient for us to say what strategy is going to be employed by the solver. Manuel said, maybe OP has a lot of medium hands, few air and few nuts. So that's similar to what Max answered, right? So if OP has like a shit ton of medium hands and just a slight amount of nuts, all of a sudden, if IP has any nuts, then all of the OP nuts are going to want to check because IP is going to bump the biggest possible size with value and bluffs, right? So it needs to be something a little bit different. I see. Give IP less nuts than 5%. Right. So now IP has only 5% nuts. So would it be 5% nuts and 95% air? If that's the case, then things may start to change, right? Because now with only 5% nuts and 95% air, what's going to happen is when OP checks with the top of his range, he can't really expect IP to push too much money into the pot, right? It's just 5% of very strong hands, which are going to need only a very small amount of bluffs to balance, and therefore villain is not putting out that much money into the pot for us. So it may be the case that OP's strongest hands start to put some money into the pot themselves. There's more to it. There's more to it that we need to figure out here. There are other things that are going to impact that strategy. Villain has a small percentage of air in the range, has a large percentage of nuts, and a large percentage of medium hands. When you say villain, you mean the IP player? Yeah, I see that you just typed that below. So if IP has a lot of nuts and a lot of medium hands, would it make sense for us to bet very small? Or in other words, which hands would benefit from betting very small against a range that has a lot of nuts? What do you think? Which hands would benefit from betting is very small against a range that has a lot of nuts? Machia said, OP has the medium hands advantage. Both have nuts, both have air. So what you're saying is mostly the difference between a more condensed or merged range and a more polarized range, right? So if both ranges have nuts and air and only this guy has medium strength hands, then this range is a little bit more merged, contains more medium hands. And we all know that it only makes sense to have small bet sizes when you do have any medium strength hands in your range. So that's kind of a given, I guess. And it is correct. I forgot. OP must also have some air that it wants to bluff. Right. Yes. It needs to have bluffs as well. Otherwise, that bet size may not be effective enough in order to force villain to put money into the pot for us, as we're going to see in a minute. Rob Boss said, easy hands to fold against a raise. That is true. If you're constructing any betting range, you need to have a bet fold range. Otherwise, you're exploitable. Villain just going to raise for value and never bluff. So it is true that if you're developing a betting range and the SPR is big enough, of course, you're going to have a bet fold range. All right, so again, a lot of different answers. It may not be very clear exactly where the V comes from when you use those kinds of bets. So while we go through these examples, I want you to be always thinking about, okay, how can this strategic option generate EV from my range? What hands have their EV increased by having this strategic option available? That's how you're going to understand what needs to happen for that bet to make sense. If you can understand which hands benefit from that strategic option, then it's much easier for you to realize in what situations it would be a thing for that to happen or not, right? So we're going to take a look at a first example where these kinds of bets make sense. And we're going to take a look at the example. We're going to see the line in which it happens. And then I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think is the distribution of both players' ranges for this example? Right, so we're in a 3-bet pot here. Button opens 2.5. We 3-bet from the small blind. The flop comes Queen 7 deuce rainbow. Right, the flop comes Queen 7 deuce rainbow. I'm going to put this down here. We have a strategy where we check 35% of the time, block bet 38% of the time, and bet half pot 26% of the time. We're going to choose to block bet this time, and villain is going to raise. Against a block bet, villain is supposed to raise sometimes, around 13% of the time here. Mostly top pairs and then some bluffs, some 7x as well here. Stuff you guys are probably already familiar with. So villain raises. We're going to call. So we're going to have to continue a lot here with our bluff catchers. We're going to have a lot of pocket pairs, a lot of queen X. We're going to have to float some backdoor draws as well. So we see here king jack suited calling pretty much all the pretty much all the time with the backdoor flush draw. We have ace highs calling as well all the time with backdoor flush draw. All right, so we're going to call. We're going to have a blank turn. We see we have some leads here. Don't care about that lead for now. Then villain is going to have a bet check strategy. He's betting 2/3 of the time, checking 1/3 of the time. And then he's going to check back, and river is a 4. When we take a look at river 4 here, we see that our range contains a lot of these very tiny bets. So 23% of the time, we're going to be using that 10% bet. And there are some hands in our range that really prefer using that size over any other size. In fact, I guess the colors are not very distinctive here, so it's hard to see. But for example, a hand like pocket queens never wants to use other size, or it does use other size. So queens uses both, jacks uses both as well, it seems. All of these hands here that are bluff catchers, they're using the 10% sizing, and sometimes the 1/3 sizing here, 35% size. Right, so looking at this line, looking at this board, what would you guys, how do you perceive the distribution from both players' ranges here? Let's try to paint a picture of what's the distribution like for that position player here, and what's the distribution like for the AP player. Type there in the chat, what do you feel is the distribution for both players here? Try to talk mostly about the air, middling hands, and nuts, right? These are the 3 categories we're very concerned with. So what's the equity distribution for both players here in terms of air, middling hands, and nuts? And then we're going to compare that in a second. In the ranges tab, we're going to see if you guys were close or not. We have more nuts, more middling hands, and less air, said Philip. I think that is correct, Philip, but try not to think in relative terms, try to think in absolute terms. Okay, so sometimes just the relative strength of certain parts of a range is not enough to understand the strategies. We need to know, for example, what's the absolute amount of air in your range. So if you say that you have more than your opponent or less than your opponent, it may not be sufficient to understand what's going on. You have to know exactly how much air you have. Is it a third of a range? Is it half of your range? If you have 5 and your opponent has 6, then maybe that's not really relevant enough, right? So the absolute terms is important. Joseph Adams said OP has 75% mid, 10% air, and 15% nuts. All right, so a very, very bluff catcher heavy range there with middling strength hands, very few air. Max said OP has 10% nuts, 65% medium hands, 25% air. And IP has 10% nuts, 30% middling strength, and 60% air. All right, so for both Max and Philip, it seems clear that IP has more air than OP in the situation, which makes a lot of sense given the line, right? The turn was a complete blank, and IP decided to check behind in a spot where he doesn't really need to slow play much. He's just concerned with maximizing the EV of the top of his range. So it makes sense to consider that the IP has a lot of air here, especially because the 4 doesn't really improve anything, right? The 4 is a very, very clear blank. Whereas OP, we're seeing in our face here, has a lot of these pocket pairs, a lot of Queen X. So the idea that OP has few air and IP has a lot of air, I think is certainly correct. Who else wants to give it a shot here? Now, one thing that is interesting about these kinds of nodes is that you're rarely going to see large bets. And if you think about it, the all-in sizing here is not even all that large, right? So going all in here is only a 93% pot bet. So it's less than the full pot. So for example, why do you guys think a hand as strong as ace queen here or aces is never shoving in the spot? So if you take a look at the equity of these hands, so aces has 93% equity, ace queen has 90, but these hands are never shoving, they're never putting all the money in. Why do you guys think that this is happening? What's the theoretical justification for this? Manuel said, just try to figure out the air parts. OP maybe only has 15% air. We're gonna take a look at that. Maybe a little bit more. We see there that there's a decent amount of king highs, and if you consider ace highs air as well, it's probably gonna be a bit more due to the amount of ace king off. But if you consider only the king highs, then it's probably around that. Philip said, we block villain's calling range for a big bet. Let's take a look at villain's check back range on the turn. So these are the hands that villain is checking back on the turn. He's gonna have some ace highs. He has some queen X, so a little bit of king queen, a very tiny amount of ace queen. He has pocket nines, pocket eights, pocket sixes, some pocket fives, 5-4 suited, and some 7x as well, 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited. So it is true that we're blocking a queen, but villain does have other hands to call off as well. These bluff catchers on this region here. What else are you guys saying? All the hands that would call all in as IP are jamming themselves. All hands that would call all in as IP are jamming themselves. Well, if that was the case, then we should always check our strong hands, right? If every single hand that villain calls an all-in with is jamming themselves, then we should just always check our strong hands, right? Because then we get value from all the hands that we would by betting, but we also get value from their bluffs, right? So that's probably not true that all hands that call are jamming themselves, because otherwise we would just always check the top of our range. People are seeing a lot of blocking villains calling range. Well, what about a hand like sevens, for example? Sevens is not blocking much of villains calling range, and yet it's almost pure checking here. So why would be that the case if blockers are not anymore the problem? We have a lot of medium straight hands and need nuts to protect that range, said Matthias. Nice. We're going to be talking about the concept of protecting your range, right? This is something that I think we already covered. I think it was the last time we talked about this a little bit, but we're always going to be talking about that concept. It always comes back in some form of the other, right? But the whole concept of protecting your range needs to be taking, you need to be very careful with that concept, right? So putting very strong hands in your checking range happens because your hand is indifferent. Your hand makes exactly the same amount of money by betting or checking. And usually this can happen when you have a lot of medium straight hands, because when you have a lot of medium straight hands, your opponent is going to want to put money into the pot with his nuts and his bluffs, right? So the fact that you have a lot of medium straight hands make it so that when you check, your opponent puts money into the pot for you, which then increases the EV of checking with your strong hands, right? So there's always this balance of, okay, because I have bluff catchers, my opponent puts money into the pot for me, which benefits slow playing my strongest hands. Okay, so that's generally what's going to be happening in these situations. Very superficially, of course. I agree with Matthias, and probably we don't have enough air to polarize. Nice. That's another interesting consideration here. So basically what João is saying, well, we don't have enough bluffs to be able to size up. And if you ever end up in a situation like this, then that will be true. However, we know that the solver is always trying to play balanced ranges, right? The solver is always arriving at balanced ranges because that's the only way to maximize EV against a strong opponent. So if you ever miss value with the top of your range because you lack enough bluffs, then that means you constructed your range in a not sufficiently proper way on prior streets. And you can observe this concept in some very unusual lines the solver plays, where sometimes the solver floats bets with air only to have the ability to have enough air on the next street. Okay, this happens in a few situations where if you just call bluff catchers, you never have bluffs on the next street. And because you're gonna have a lot of nuts in the next street, you have to float some air in order to be able to balance that value region, right? So this happens at equilibrium sometimes. Max said IP range is relatively polarized and we make the most money with our nuts by checking and betting small, since villain will bet large for us and we can get value from IP's air. All right, so I think I got the idea here. Since IP is very polarized, then what we're trying to make money off from is villain's air, right? So if villain doesn't have many bluff catchers, how do you make money with the top of your range, right? Villain's gonna have some nuts himself, and because of blocker effects and probably splits, you don't make much money off of your opponent's top of range. So if villain doesn't have bluff catchers, then you have to try and come up with a way to make money off of his air, right? And that's absolutely correct. That's actually the premise of the Ace King Queen toy game. If you're here and you haven't watched the weekly coaching on the Ace King Queen toy game, then I definitely recommend that once you finish here at this weekly coaching, you go back and watch that video, because that's probably the most important toy game in the entire game of No Limit Hold'em. All right. And those are not even my words. Those are the words of Bill Perkins in the Mathematics of Poker book, because that toy game definitely teaches a lot about the mechanics of the game. Right. So let's try and take a look first at the ranges, see if you guys came close to what's going on here. Right. So this is the equity distribution graph for both players' ranges. You can also take a look at the equity buckets and see what's going on. So take a look at the IP player first, which is the button here. That's as polarized as it gets, right? For most poker situations, you have a range that has 32% of very low equity hands. So hands here with 50% equity or lower. I don't think even that most hands get close to 50%. You see here a lot of hands with 31, 32, 30, 29, 28. So villain has a lot of weak hands, and he basically doesn't have middling strength hands. If you take a look at these three buckets here in the middle, he has 0 of those. So 0 of 50 to 60, 0 of 60 to 70, 0.8 of 70 to 80. And then he has around 28% of very strong hands. So at the top, he does have some strong hands. He has 22% of 80 to 90 and 6.7% of 90 to 100. So it's definitely a very polarized range, as you guys have already noticed before. No surprise. And when we take a look at the OP's range, we have something very, very different. Just by taking a look here at this part of the graph, you see that from 30 to, let me put this here, 30 to 75, so that's 45%, almost half of the opposition player's range here has this middling equity, right? Something between 50 to 75, which would be these two buckets here. So that's 43% of that opposition player's range. It has a decent amount of nuts as well, around 25%. And it has way less air than the IP player. It has around 30% air as opposed to 70%. Right? So you're going to see that in all situations that a 10% bet makes sense, this is exactly the kind of distribution that is going to happen for both players' ranges. You're going to have one player having a very, very high amount of air and very low amount of bluff catchers, and another range having a very, very high amount of bluff catchers, but also having some nuts and some air. Okay. And this is going to be, this distribution favors this 10% sizing because, first of all, of what we just said about how do we generate EV from the top of our range. When you have a very strong hand against a range that has a lot of air, then the way to make EV off of that range is forcing that range to put money into the pot with bluffs against you. Okay, so you're going to see here that queens and most of the strongest hands here, almost all of the strongest hands from OP, likes to play some very tiny bets into the pot because this is going to force the IP player to find bluff raises. So you're going to see here that once you block 10%, then villain has to find bluffs with all of these raising hands here. So hands like King 6, Ace 4, Ace 8, Ace 9, Ace 10. Pocket 6s getting turned into a bluff here. 5-4, pocket 5s. So you force your opponent to put money into the pot with hands that he would likely not put money into the pot if you decided to size up yourself. Right? And then if you take a look at how villain should respond if you just went all in, you see that he's even going to be allowed to fold a queen sometimes, which is pretty crazy. You see here that king queen is already being made indifferent by your bet size. So there are a lot of things going on here that make this strategy make sense. First thing is that if you take a look at your range, you don't have a lot of air. This is something that you guys said about the maybe the opposition has the inability to size up because it doesn't have sufficient air. Well, what's going to happen is you do have hands that you can turn into a bluff, but if you turn those hands into a bluff, because they have a lot of equity, you allow your opponent to overfold relative to the MDF, right? So we see here that the strongest hand we're bluffing here is something like ace 10, I think. No, ace king. So ace king, we're shoving here, trying to get villain to fold some pairs. And if you take a look at the equity of ace king, it has 37% equity. So villain has to play in a way that he makes a hand as strong as ace king indifferent between betting and checking, which is exactly what's happening here. Ace king makes around 19 chips when he bets and 19 chips when he checks. If you were to go all in with a hand like this, then villain would have to fold the necessary amount to make you win 19 chips when you go all in with a hand like this. I'm saying 19 because I'm looking at the hands that are betting, but there are many different blockers here that impact the EV of that hand. So we're going to see that once you shove here for 93% pot, villain is folding 58% of the time, despite having sufficient bluff catchers to call. So he's folding a lot of bluff catchers he could call if you were trying to meet the MDF, which is less than a pot size here. MDF for a pot size bet would be 50% folds. So villain is folding a lot more to be able to make the strongest bluffing hands in our range indifferent between bet and check. So when that happens, sizing up doesn't allow you to get as much value as you would like from villain's bluff catchers. He's capable of overfolding and remaining unexploitable. So this is one thing. The other thing is that, and this is very important, you can threaten your opponent to capture the entire pot with your bluff catchers. So this is something very, very important that is in the core of why these bets make sense. When you have a middling straight hand out of position, one thing that is really relevant for the realization of that hand is capturing the entire pot against hands that it's currently beating. So imagine you are in position with a bluff catcher. Villain check to you, and you have 60% equity. What that means is that if you check back, you immediately gain 60% of the pot because you always captured the full pot against the hands you're currently beating. When you're out of position, however, checking doesn't realize the full pot versus the hands you're beating because you're going to get bluffed by those hands some of the time. Okay, so when you check here and villain decides to shove, which is going to happen here, let's say how often, it's going to happen 42% of the time, and villain, for instance, bluffs with a hand like Jack 10, you're going to be made indifferent with your bluff catchers, and sometimes you're even going to be forced to pure fold due to your blockers, and you don't capture the full pot against your opponent's bluffs. So you lose realization by not being able to capture the full pot against the hands you're currently beating. So that's why the combination of having a lot of middling strength hands and villain having a lot of air makes it so that your middling strength hands really want to bet tiny into the pot. You want to capture the full pot against your opponent's bluffs because that way, well, you increase your realization considering that you're not going to be forced to fold when villain is holding a weaker hand. Okay, so you have a combination that your strongest hands don't capture as much value from bluff catchers because villain doesn't have many bluff catchers to begin with. And even when he does, because the strongest bluffs in your range have a lot of equity, villain is allowed to overfold. So you're capturing even less EV against those hands. And then once you have a lot of middling hands that benefit from folding bluffs, that's exactly what's going on here. That's why these bets make sense. These hands bet because they want to fold bluffs. When they fold bluffs, these hands gain EV because they gain the full pot, which they would be bluff sometimes if they would check. And then because you're threatening your opponent or because you're putting money to the pot with these middling hands, then villain is going to find raises with the top of his range, and he's going to find bluffs with the top of his range in order to make your bluff catchers indifferent. When he does that, he's putting money into the pot with hands that he wouldn't if you would just size up yourself. So what's going on here is the top of your range benefits from this, the middling hands in your range benefit from this. And also the air in your range also benefits from this. Take a look at the weakest hands in the other position player's range here, which are these king highs. These king highs, they're printing money with these very tiny bets, which is something that may be counterintuitive, right? So why would a hand like this be printing money with these tiny bets? And I notice here that there might be some bug going on here with the EVs because the tiny bet is not showing as having EV, but we're seeing that it's getting used. There's probably some bug here with the EVs. But the thing is, when you have an air like this, it's going to be printing money because, as we saw already, villain is overfolding relative to MDF. So the amount of folds you need to print with a hand like this, you're getting way more than that because the strongest bluffs in your range are being made indifferent. The bluffs that are being made indifferent are the strongest bluffs in your range, which in this case are the ace-king hands, right? So every single hand class in your range benefits from this strategic option, right? Questions so far? Let me see what you guys are saying here. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to go, but I'll watch later for sure. All right, Manuel, thank you for participation. João said, I have a question, Sal. If the population doesn't have enough bluff raises, isn't it better to simply check more? Depends, right? If you want to play a max exploit strategy, bluff raising enough, then the best exploit would be to always bet your middling hands and never bet the top of your range. That would be the exploit. Or is it that when you use a 10% bet, do we make it so that villain can't just fold all the air because, wait, or is it that when we use a 10% bet, do we make it so that villain can't just fold all the air because if it's not being exploited? I'm sorry, man, I didn't understand this. If you could rephrase, I didn't understand the sentence. Very good. Now I understand. It was complete out of the spot. Thank you, Sal. Me too. That makes things much more clear. Me too. What exactly? Because I missed that. So that's what's going on with these 10% bets. Every single hand class in your range benefits from that strategic option just due to how the equities are distributed. You have your opponent that has a lot of air. The way to make money off of a range that has a lot of air but some nuts is to force that range to put money into the pot with the air region. If you just size up yourself, villain's not going to put money into the pot with the air region. But if you have middling hands that are threatening to capture the entire pot and putting money into the pot against a range that contains nuts, then villain is going to be forced to find bluff raises, and when he does, the top of your range gains money, right? So that's why a hand like queens, aces, etc. is never sizing up, and that's why you're seeing all of these middling hands also betting tiny. Right now we can continue to a second example. I think the second is pretty much the same thing as far as a similar line, right? So take a look at this. We are on the big blind now in a single raise pot. Villain is going to overbet into a board ace king 6. Okay, so you guys, pretty sure you guys are studying a lot these grids, and you know that ace king 6 you're supposed to big bet or check. So villain is doing big bet or check. We're gonna call with a bunch of ace x and some king x with backdoors. Notice how king x without backdoor is already a pure fold. Okay, don't make the mistake of overcalling these situations. So you have a hand like as strong as king queen just folding here a lot of the time, and king x with weaker kickers just pure folding. Make sure you don't overcall these spots. And then turn comes a blank and villain checks back. So very similar situation in which villain polarized the flop and then decided to check back on a blank on the turn. Well, when that happens, what we're going to see is that his equity distribution is very close to what we saw before, an insane amount of air, but also still a little bit of nuts, right? He may have slow played some hands on the turn, or he may have improved a little bit of his check back range in that river card. Okay, but the The gist of it is that he has a shit ton of air and then some nuts. Here he has even a little bit more bluff catches than on the previous example, but then the distribution for you is also very similar. You have a low amount of air, a very significant amount of bluff catchers, but also a significant amount of very strong hands. And what you see happening is exactly the same strategy again. You're going to have a lot of 10% bets in your range. And one thing that has to come in your mind is that, for example, a hand like Queen 10, you would be losing money with Queen 10 here if you decide to bet big every single time, because your opponent is not going to put enough money into the pot for you. But if you decide to bet as tiny as 2 blinds here into a pot of 19 blinds, then villain is going to be forced to find a lot of raises because he does have the nuts and you do have a lot of bluff catchers, right? So he's going to, for example, go all in with his Queen 10, and he's going to put his entire stack with hands like 10-9, 10-8, 10-7, some queen highs as well, which are hands that he would not put money into the pot for you if you decided to size up yourself. So a hand like Queen 10 benefits from that strategic option. And also your bluff catchers greatly benefit from that strategic option. So you have hands like King 10 and middling ace highs. So ace 8, ace 7, King 10 are hands that are betting pure for this sizing, which means that if you don't use this bet sizing, you're losing EV with these particular hands. They're maximizing their EV with this exact strategic option. And these hands, they can still generate some value by getting called by worse hands, and they're getting folds by hands that would probably check. So again, your bluff catchers gain from this, your nuts gain from this, and your air gains from this. You see here that all of your missed flush draws are printing money with these tiny bets. You see a hand like 9-7 of hearts. He's betting 90% of the time with this very tiny bet. And it's printing 2 blinds every time it does that. Why is it printing? Well, villain has to overfold relative to MDF. If you guys don't know the formula for MDF, I suggest you memorize it. It's pretty simple. It's just 1 divided by 1 plus bet size. So if you're betting 10% of the pot, this is 1 divided by 1.1. So it's 90.9%. So villain, if he were playing naive MDF to make a 0 equity hand indifferent, then he would have to defend 90% of his range. But here he's folding 24%. So any hand that has very low equity is going to print money in the bluffing line. Okay, so that's what's happening with all of those airs that you have here, missed flush draws, blah, blah, blah. Villain simply can't call more because he has to make the strongest hands in your range, the strongest bluffs in your range indifferent. And the strongest hands you're bluffing here is hands as strong as 6x and 5x. Right? These are the weakest hands you have here because the river completed a jack. So the river completes a jack. Because you just called flop with strong draws and ace x and some king x, the weakest hands you have in your range on the river are 6x type hands, and those are the hands that are being made indifferent. Okay, it's very cool to study this as well because you learn more about the concept of indifference. Villain doesn't have to make all your bluffs indifferent. He needs to make indifferent the region of bluffs that could exploit him if they would not be made indifferent. You cannot exploit villain with air because you don't have enough air to begin with. You have very low amount of pure air, but you do have an amount of very weak hands that still have some showdown value that you could exploitatively overbluff or overcheck if villain doesn't make them indifferent. So this is the category of hands that is being made indifferent by the AP player. When he makes this region indifferent, then all of a sudden, all of the weaker hands than this are pure bets. They're going to be printing money with their bluffs, right? So again, bluff catchers benefit from this, nuts benefit from this, air benefits from this, right? More questions? So is it because we make IP fold more hands that we would realize equity with middling hands? Because IP is not going all in a lot less when you bet 10%. Let me read that again. So is it because we make IP fold more hands that would All right, 1 second, guys. Tá bom, depois eu desço. All right. So let me read that again. So is it because we make IP fold more hands that would realize equity with? Yeah, I don't understand this. If you could rephrase, Philip, I'm having a hard time understanding what you mean. Is there significance in the turn going check check in both examples? I assume it's because that action creates a more polarized range for the villain. Yes, yes, my friend Rob Boss. So I picked these first two examples that they are pretty clear in a sense that you can very quickly see that the IP is going to have a lot of air, right? So when IP polarizes on the flop and then checks back on the turn, then that is a very natural situation where his range is going to contain a lot of air, okay? João said, sorry for my English, no problem at all. If you bet 10%, villain can't just fold all the air because if he do, he'll be overfolding versus our bet sizing. Well, that's not the case, okay? He's already overfolding. What he cannot do is he cannot never bluff raise. That's what he cannot do. If he never bluff raises, then all of our middling straight hands are going to print money with a tiny bet. Okay, you're going to see that the idea behind villain having that bluff raise range is to make some middling hands indifferent. Okay, so ace 9 here is being made indifferent, ace 10 is being made indifferent. You're going to have a class of middling hands in our range. King 9 is being made indifferent, king queen, that if he doesn't find the bluff raises, then those hands print money with a tiny bet. Okay, that's what's going on. That's exactly what goes on in the ace king queen toy game. So very quickly, ace king queen toy game. You have either an ace, a king, or a queen, and villain has exactly the same range, ace, king, or a queen. When you have a king, villain can only have an ace or a queen. In other words, when you have a king, you're either running into the nuts or into air. And in that toy game, the solution is for kings to always bet small. Kings actually is a mixed strategy. So kings bet small some of the time against that range. It's very counterintuitive to think, right? Why are we betting king some of the time if we're either running into the nuts or running into a bluff? Well, the reason is that you're trying to capture the full pot with kings against the queen's bluffs, because if you check with kings, then queens is going to bet some of the time and is going to bluff you off, and you're not going to realize your full pot against the bottom of villain's range. So you bet sometimes with kings. Once you start to bet sometimes with kings, then naturally villain starts to raise sometimes with queens to prevent you from bluffing kings all the time. If villain never raises with the queen, then you capture the full pot every time against the queen, which is obviously higher V than checking, because if you check, you don't win the full pot against queens because queens bluffs you sometimes. So if you start to bet sometimes with the king, then villain has to raise sometimes with the queen to prevent you from betting all the time. But once he starts raising with the queen, then now betting small with the ace makes a lot of sense, because now you're generating value from the queen. If you size up when you hold an ace, villain can only have a king or a queen. But when you hold an ace, villain doesn't need to call you all that often with the king, because he can catch your bluffs with the ace that he has. So by sizing down, you capture value from the queen. But villain raises with the queen because he needs to prevent you from betting all the time with the middling hands. Okay, that's exactly what's happening. Now the rest of your question. So if the population is overfolding because it doesn't find enough raises, our average hands would gain more EV. Otherwise, when we check, villain can go all in. Those hands that could generate more EV, that 10% bet, we have to fold with some frequency. I hope I managed to express myself well. So if population is overfolding because it's find enough raises, yes, if population doesn't find enough raises, then what happens is the middling hands gain EV. They should just bet tiny all the time, because they're capturing the entire pot against the bluffs, which they would not capture all the time if they checked, because the bluffs would bluff them off sometimes, okay? Otherwise, when we check, villain can go all in on those hands that could generate more EV in a 10% bet. We have to fold with some frequency. Yeah, that's the idea. Okay, but just remember, he raises not because he doesn't. He raises not because he needs to avoid overfolding. He raises because he needs to prevent us from betting all the time with our middling hands. Okay, he needs to make our middling hands a difference between betting and checking. How do we quickly find these spots in game? Pattern recognition of common lines. Common lines, not necessarily, I would say. Obviously, common lines help. So, for example, here, you can quickly realize that once villain polarizes the flop and checks back the turn, your distribution is very middling strength heavy, while still having some nuts, and his distribution is very air heavy. So any situation where villain polarizes the flop and then checks back the turn, you can quickly realize that it probably makes sense to develop that strategic option. Okay, but any situation in which that distribution can happen is a situation that you can use that strategic option. So most importantly, you need to realize what distribution makes sense for me to use this option and which situations can produce that distribution. And we're going to end with the second type of examples that is going to show exactly, it's going to show a different kind of context in which this happens, which can be maybe counterintuitive for some people. All right. So this is going to be the example. Now we're the big blind versus button a single raise pot. And villain is going to bet the flop small. Okay. So villain bets the flop small on this board. Pay attention to how much button has to check on a board like this. Checking half of the time. So we can't bet range just because it's king high. All right. These two low connected cards and the fact that it's two-tone is going to make it so that a lot of hands in the range are going to want to check. But anyways, villain bets, you call. Turn is at 10, double flush draw. Villain is going to overbet. You're going to call. And then river is going to come a king. And look at what happens on the river king, right? Fishes have been doing that for some time, and you thought it was a bad play, but it's actually GTO, all right? So the river is a king, and you may think, wow, this is a good card for IP. But then you're supposed to donk 40% of the time with a 10% pot bet, okay? And it's very counterintuitive because we often think of these situations as, you know, we just check because villain has a stronger range, and then he's going to put money in with his bluffs, which benefits the top of our range, and that's it, right? But that's not what's going on here. This is actually the exact same amount of equity distribution. If you take a look at the ranges, particularly on this king river card, in which this does not happen, but particularly on the king, the exact same type of equity distribution is happening, okay? So let's take a look at the equity distribution for the previous examples. So you always have low amount of air for OP, very high amount of air for IP, low amount of bluff catcher for IP, and high amount of bluff catcher for OOP, right? So whenever the distributions are the same, the strategy is going to be the same. That's why I like to study poker from the perspective of distribution matchups. I don't care if it's 3-bet pot, single raise pot, if I'm the caller or aggressor. In fact, no one should care about that. All you should care about is the distribution matchup of both ranges. Solver doesn't care who is the aggressor, who has the initiative. In fact, those concepts are human constructs. They don't exist in the solver land. Solver only cares about numbers, right? About EV. And the more you detach yourself from these concepts, the more you can understand the true equilibrium and what's going on in the equilibrium, right? So this is a situation in which the exact same of distribution matchup happens, which then makes it so that this strategic option makes sense with your range. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, you have middling hands that benefit from folding out villain's air. And this is really important here because villain has a shit ton of air. Villain has 65% of air in his range. That's an extremely high amount. And you do have a very significant amount of bluff catchers. If you take a look at this middling region here, which is 10x and 5x, that's 38% of your range. And that region greatly benefits from putting a very tiny bet in and forcing villain to fold his heir, right? This is really, really nice. So by putting a 10% bet in, you get 21% fold. So 21% of the time, you're going to capture the full pot. This is really, really nice for these hands. And you see that these hands are the ones that are benefiting the most from the strategic option because you have some pure bets in there. You have 10-7 being a pure bet, 10-5 being a pure bet. So these hands, they are gaining EV by using this strategic option. They are capturing more of the pot against villain's heir. Then you have, well, some strong hands that benefit from this as well. So you have a hand like King 10. King 10 also benefits from betting that size and forcing villain to put money into the pot with his heir. And you can put in this bet with other kinds of hands. For example, your missed draws. So your missed draws are going to print money with this bet sizing as well. So you have 6-4 suited and 6-3 suited, printing money with this bet size. Take a look here. They're making 4 big blinds. 6-4 of spades makes 4 big blinds. 6-4 of hearts makes 2 big blinds. Okay, this is really significant. All right, this is 2 big blinds per hand. That's 200 big blinds per 100 hands. Obviously, these kinds of spots don't happen very often. We're gonna see that it has to be in a specific type of river card, but when it does happen, it's quite profitable for you to do so. All right, so same distribution matchup, same kind of strategy. João said, I have to see this class again, many concepts. Yeah, definitely not the easiest concept to grasp, but certainly one that will greatly benefit your game if you can understand it deeply, right? Max said, oh, this is a cool example. Yeah, this is definitely a very, very cool example in which it can be counterintuitive, right? So the idea here is the same. You gain value from middling hands by folding out heir. You gain value from the top of your range by forcing him to find bluff raises, and you gain value with your own heir because villain is going to be forced to overfold relative to MDF. So every single hand class in your range wins, except for this specific region here. This specific region of ace highs, they have way too much showdown value in a spot where villain is going to be checking a decent amount. And the thing about this river card is that it greatly decreases the number of very strong hands in villain's range, right? So the trick part here about the River King is that it decreases the amount of villain's value to the point that he has a very, very high amount of heir. If you take a look at a very blank river, for example, like a 3, we see that the strategic option doesn't make sense. It's never used. And the reason why is that villain has way less heir now because all of the nuts he had on the prior streets continue to be, or the amount of combos he hasn't decreased. The amount of very nutted combos that he had didn't increase. When the board blocks a king, then now he has less combos of nuts, makes it so that his range is more heir heavy, which makes it so that then leading out with your bluff catchers is a good idea, right? If the river is a blank, then villain doesn't have that insane amount of heir, and now you would be putting yourself in a bad situation. You see here that villain has a lot of nuts, whereas here he has way less. He has something like 27% nuts, whereas here he has a lot more if you consider 80% plus. That's almost half of his range, right? Nice. So this is it then for today. Hope you enjoyed this concept. And what I think you should extract the most from this is, first of all, realizing that understanding the equilibrium is about understanding the distribution matchups. If you can understand the distribution matchups of both players' ranges, then the strategy will follow. Same distributions will produce same strategies. So if you can always be paying attention to how your range is distributed, how your opponent's range is distributed, then deriving the strategy is going to be a lot easier. And second of all, which is very, very important, is maximizing DV against heir-heavy ranges is about forcing villain to put money with his heir into the pot. So if villain has a lot of heir, the way to gain value from the top of your hands in your range is to force villain to put money into the pot with air. And you can do that when you have middling hands. When you have middling hands, you can threaten villain to capture the full pot against his bluffs, which forces him to find bluff raises, which then increases the value of the top of your range against hands that would not really put money into the pot if you would just put money yourself, bet bigger, and all that stuff, right? This is it for today. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I see you next time. All right, guys. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.